A dog saves its owner from a dangerous situation in the woods. What happens next will amaze you. The woods were alive with whispers, the kind that danced through the trees and settled uneasily in the shadows. Thick, ancient oaks reached skyward, their gnarled branches blotting out the moonlight, leaving the forest floor bathed in an eerie half-light. The air was dense with the earthy scent of damp moss, mingling with the crisp tang of pine. A gentle breeze swayed the leaves, creating a symphony of rustling sounds that felt more alive than the quiet steps echoing through the underbrush. Lena Carter tightened her grip on the leash, her fingers trembling slightly despite the insulated gloves. Her dog Max, a German shepherd with a coat as dark as the night, was unusually alert. His ears pricked, tail rigid. He moved with deliberate precision. Lena could feel his tension through the leash, a subtle but unmistakable warning that sent a chill racing down her spine. It was supposed to be a short hike, a chance to clear her head after a long week. Lena loved the forest, its quiet solitude, and the way it seemed to cradle her in its timeless embrace. But tonight was different. The usual serenity had been replaced with an oppressive stillness, as though the woods were holding their breath, waiting. The trail ahead twisted sharply, disappearing into a thicket of dense undergrowth. Lena hesitated. She'd taken this path countless times before, but tonight, every instinct screamed for her to turn back. She glanced at Max, seeking reassurance, but the look in his amber eyes was anything but comforting. His gaze darted toward the shadows, his growl low and guttural. "Easy, boy," Lena murmured, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She scanned the forest, her flashlight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move just out of reach. There was nothing there, at least nothing she could see, but the feeling of being watched was palpable, a weight pressing against her chest. She took a tentative step forward, the crunch of leaves underfoot breaking the unnatural silence. Max tugged on the leash, his body tense and coiled like a spring. The flashlight beam caught a glint of something ahead. Metal? Eyes? Lena couldn't be sure, but the sight froze her in place. And then, the sound came. It was faint at first, like the whisper of wind through the trees, but it grew louder, more distinct, a rhythmic crunching of footsteps on gravel. Someone or something was out there. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the realization set in. She wasn't alone. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound calm. The woods swallowed the word, leaving only the echo of her own fear. Max barked sharply, the sound ricocheting through the trees like a gunshot. The leash slipped from Lena's grasp as he lunged forward, disappearing into the darkness. "Max!" she screamed, her voice cracking as panic surged through her. She stumbled after him, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as she pushed through the undergrowth. Branches clawed at her jacket, snagging on fabric and hair, but she barely noticed. Her only thought was to catch up to Max, to keep him safe. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, each step pulling her deeper into the forest's grasp. The footsteps were closer now, heavier, more deliberate. They weren't hers and they weren't Max's. She glanced over her shoulder, the flashlight's beam slicing through the shadows. Nothing. And yet, the feeling of being watched grew, stronger, suffocating in its intensity. A sudden yelp pierced the air, a sound so sharp and pained that it stopped Lena in her tracks. "Max!" she cried again, her voice breaking with desperation. She stumbled forward, her flashlight catching. Glimpses of movement in the distance. The flash of fur, the glint of eyes, the silhouette of something too large to be a deer. The trees opened into a small clearing, and there he was. Max stood rigid, his body a shield between Lena and the shadowy figure looming at the edge of the clearing. The figure was indistinct, shrouded in darkness, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the weight of its gaze was suffocating. Max growled, a low primal sound that made Lena's stomach churn. She stepped closer, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "Max, come here," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Max didn't move. His focus was unwavering, his protective instincts in overdrive. And then the figure moved. It was sudden, a blur of motion that sent Lena stumbling backward. Max lunged, his bark a ferocious warning that echoed through the clearing. The figure retreated into the shadows, its presence lingering like a stain on the air. Lena dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around Max's neck as he whimpered, softly, his body trembling against hers. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, her voice shaking as much as her hands. But it wasn't okay. The woods had never felt so alien, so hostile. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. As she sat there in the clearing, clutching Max like a lifeline, the weight of the forest pressed down on her. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with unspoken threats, the promise of danger lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Lena knew they had to leave, but the path back felt a million miles away. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand, and tightened her grip on Max's leash. "Let's go home," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The journey back was a blur, a frantic race against the unknown. Max stayed close, his body pressed against her leg, his ears swiveling at every sound. The forest seemed to watch them, its silence more oppressive than any noise. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, Lena's legs felt like jelly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She collapsed onto the ground, Max immediately curling up beside her. The safety of the open sky felt like a reprieve, but the memory of the figure in the woods lingered, an indelible mark on her mind. She stroked Max's fur, her fingers brushing over the rough patches where twigs and leaves clung to his coat. "You saved me," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Max licked her hand, his eyes soft and full of understanding. But as Lena looked back toward the dark line of trees, a single question burned in her mind. What had they just escaped from? The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting warm golden rays onto the worn oak table, where Lena sat with a steaming cup of coffee. Her hands, still trembling from the events of the previous night, wrapped tightly around the ceramic mug. The familiar aroma of roasted beans mixed with the faint scent of Max's fur as he lay sprawled on the floor beside her, his ears flicking, occasionally in response to the subtle creaks of the old house. Lena's small cabin sat on the outskirts of town, nestled at the edge of the forest that had always been her sanctuary. It was a modest home, built by her grandfather decades ago, with sturdy wooden beams and a stone fireplace that crackled to life on cold winter evenings. Here she felt safe, or she used to. Max stirred, lifting his head to look at her with those soulful amber eyes that always seemed to know what she was feeling. He let out a soft whine, a sound that tugged at her heart. "You're worried about me, aren't you?" Lena said, her voice soft and tinged with affection. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, the act as soothing to her as it was to him. "I'm okay, really." But she wasn't okay, and Max knew it. Lena's days were usually filled with a comforting routine. Morning started with coffee and a quick walk through the woods, followed by hours spent at her desk, working remotely as a freelance editor. The afternoons were for tending to her small garden, reading or exploring new trails with Max. It was a quiet life, far removed from the bustling city she'd left behind years ago. She'd moved here for peace, for solitude. The forest had always been her escape, a place where the weight of the world seemed to lift. But now the thought of stepping back into those woods made her chest tighten with unease. The soft chime of her phone interrupted her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A text from her best friend, Emily. "Hey, just checking in. How are you? Haven't heard from you in a few days. Miss you." Lena hesitated before typing a response. She hadn't told anyone about what happened last night. How could she? It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a horror movie. Lena. "Hey, Em. I'm okay. Just had a rough night. Miss you too." The lie felt heavy, but she wasn't ready to share the truth. "Not yet." Max barked softly, his gaze fixed on the door. His sudden alertness sent a ripple of unease through her. "What is it, boy?" she asked, standing and peering out the window. The driveway was empty, the dirt road leading to her cabin undisturbed. Beyond that, the forest loomed, its dense canopy casting long shadows even in the daylight. Nothing seemed out of place, but the memory of the figure in the woods lingered, a shadow in her mind. "Probably just a squirrel," Lena muttered, trying to reassure herself. Max's ears remained perked, but he settled down again, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Shaking. Off her unease, Lena turned her attention to the stack of manuscripts waiting on her desk. Immersing herself in work had always been her way of coping, and today was no different. The rhythmic click of her keyboard filled the cabin, a steady background noise that helped drown out her thoughts. As the hours passed, Lena began to feel a semblance of normalcy returning. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth spilling through the windows and onto the polished wood floors. Max dozed by the fireplace, his steady breathing a comforting presence. By mid-afternoon, Lena decided to take a break. She grabbed Max's leash, hesitating for a moment before slipping it onto his collar. "Just a quick walk around the garden," she said, more to herself than to Max. The garden was her pride and joy, a small but vibrant patch of life amidst the wilderness. Rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs thrived under her care, while sunflowers stood tall, their bright yellow heads swaying gently in the breeze. Max trotted ahead, sniffing at the edges of the garden, his tail wagging slightly. Watching him, Lena felt a flicker of peace. The sunlight, the fresh air, the familiar rhythm of life, it all felt like a fragile tether to normalcy. But even here, the memory of the woods lingered. As she knelt to pull a stubborn weed from the soil, Lena's mind drifted back to the shadowy figure. Who or what had it been, and why had it felt so wrong? She shook her head, trying to dispel the thoughts. "Focus on the present," she muttered, wiping her hands on her jeans. The sound of a car engine startled her, breaking the quiet. A sleek black SUV rumbled up the driveway, its glossy exterior gleaming in the sunlight. Lena's brow furrowed. She wasn't expecting visitors. "Max," barked sharply, positioning himself between Lena and the approaching vehicle. The SUV came to a stop, and the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a crisp suit that seemed out of place in the rural setting. He was tall, with neatly combed dark hair and sharp features. His gaze swept over the cabin and garden before landing on Lena. "Miss Carter?" he asked, his voice smooth but firm. Lena stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Who's asking?" The man offered a polite smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I work for the State Forestry Department. I'm here about the incident in the woods last night." Her stomach dropped. "What? Incident?" Daniel's expression shifted, his smile fading into something more serious. "We received a report about unusual activity in the area. A local hunter spotted something concerning." Lena's heart raced. "Concerning how?" Daniel hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. He described seeing an unidentified figure, human-like, but not quite. "The details are unclear, but we're investigating." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. "And you think it's connected to what I saw?" Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You saw something too?" Lena hesitated. She hadn't intended to share her experience, but the man's demeanor, calm, professional, yet undeniably serious, made her rethink. "Yes," she admitted. "Last night, in the woods, it was strange." Daniel nodded, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. "Can you describe what you saw?" She recounted the events, her voice trembling as she described the shadowy figure, Max's reaction, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. Daniel listened intently, jotting down notes, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he closed the notepad and looked at her. "Thank you for sharing that. I'd advise staying out of the woods for now. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation, and it's best if civilians steer clear." Lena nodded, her mind racing. "Do you think it's dangerous?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "We're not sure yet. But if you notice anything unusual, don't hesitate to call this number." He handed her a business card before turning back to his SUV. As the vehicle disappeared down the driveway, Lena stood frozen, the card clutched tightly in her hand. Max pressed against her leg, his warmth a small comfort against the growing unease in her chest. Whatever was happening in those woods, it wasn't over. The evening sun cast long shadows over the forest, painting the trees in hues of gold and amber. Lena stood at her kitchen sink, staring out the window. The view should have brought her comfort, but unease prickled at her skin. Max lay at her feet, his ears twitching as if he sensed her anxiety. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Daniel's visit earlier had done little to settle her nerves. If anything, it had confirmed what she already knew. The forest wasn't the safe haven it once was. Lena forced herself to focus on the task at hand, washing the last of the dinner dishes. The rhythmic motion of scrubbing plates and the sound of running water provided a small sense of normalcy. But then Max barked, a sharp, urgent sound that sent a jolt through her. "What is it, boy?" she asked, drying her hands quickly. Max was at the door now, his body rigid, tail low and ears perked. His growl was low and menacing, a sound she rarely heard from him. Peering out the window, Lena scanned the yard. At first, she saw nothing unusual. The garden was still, the driveway empty, but then out of the corner of her eye she caught movement near the tree line, a shadow. Her breath hitched. She squinted, trying to make out the figure. It was there, standing just beyond the reach of the fading sunlight, too far to see clearly but close enough to send a shiver down her spine. Lena's hand instinctively went to Max's leash. "Stay here," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to herself or the dog. Max let out another growl, his body tense. Ignoring her own fear, Lena opened the door, stepping onto the porch. The cool evening air nipped at her skin, but her focus was entirely on the shadowy figure. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. No response. She took a cautious step forward, Max at her side. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, an ominous silhouette against the darkening woods. Lena's heart pounded. "Who's there?" Still no answer. The silence was suffocating. The birds had stopped chirping, the wind had stilled. Even the usual hum of distant crickets was absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. And then the figure moved. It wasn't a normal movement, not a step or a turn. It was quick, almost inhumanly so, like a blur of darkness shifting through the trees. Lena stumbled back, her hand gripping Max's leash tightly. The dog barked furiously now, his powerful body straining. Against her hold, "Max, no!" she shouted, but it was too late. The leash slipped from her grasp and Max bolted toward the woods, barking with a ferocity she'd never seen before. "Max, come back!" Lena cried, panic lacing her voice. Without thinking, she grabbed a flashlight from the porch and ran after him. The beam of light cut through the shadows, illuminating the narrow trail that led into the forest. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper, the trees closing in around her. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her flinch. "Max!" she called again, her voice echoing eerily in the stillness. A distant bark answered her, followed by a low growl. The sound sent a chill down her spine. "Please, God, let him be okay," she whispered, picking up her pace. As she pushed forward, the flashlight's beam caught glimpses of movement, branches swaying, shadows darting. Her fear was a living thing now, clawing at her chest and threatening to overwhelm her. And then she saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in an otherworldly light. It wasn't the soft glow of the moon or the warm flicker of firelight. This was something else. Cold. Pale and unnatural. Lena slowed her pace, her breath shallow. She could hear Max barking, but the sound was muffled as if coming from far away. She stepped into the clearing, the strange light casting an eerie glow over the scene. The trees seemed to bend inward, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the center. And there in the middle of the clearing was Max. He stood rigid, his fur bristling, teeth bared in a snarl. His gaze was fixed on something just beyond Lena's line of sight. "Max," she whispered, taking a step closer. The dog didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. It was as if he were transfixed, caught in a battle of wills with whatever lurked in the shadows. Lena turned the flashlight toward the spot Max was staring at, her hands trembling. The beam illuminated a figure, a humanoid shape, but wrong in every way. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over a gaunt frame. Long, spindly limbs ended in claw-like hands, and its face was the stuff of nightmares. Hollow eyes, black as voids, stared back at her, and a mouth too wide twisted into a grotesque grin. Lena's scream caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The creature tilted its head as if studying her, its movements jerky and unnatural. Max barked again, his growls growing louder, more ferocious. And then the creature lunged. It moved with terrifying speed, a blur of pale limbs and darkness. Lena barely had time to react before Max sprang into action. The dog leapt between her and the creature, his powerful jaws snapping with a force that made Lena's stomach churn. "Max, no!" she cried. But the dog was relentless. The two figures clashed in a whirlwind of motion, the creature's claws swiping and Max's teeth sinking into flesh. The sound of snarls and growls mixed with the sickening thud of impact. Lena's instincts took over. She searched the ground frantically, her hand closing around a heavy branch. With a surge of adrenaline, she swung the makeshift weapon, striking the creature with all her strength. It let out an ear-piercing screech, a sound so unearthly that it made her ears ring. The creature staggered, its hollow eyes narrowing. For a moment it seemed to consider retreating. Max seized the opportunity, lunging again and sinking his teeth into the creature's leg. With another inhuman scream, the figure wrenched itself free and disappeared into the shadows, moving so fast it was as if it had never been there at all. Silence fell over the clearing. Lena dropped the branch, her hands shaking. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog turned to her, his sides heaving, his fur matted with blood. But he was alive. "Oh, Max," Lena sobbed, falling to her knees and wrapping her arms around him. He licked her face, his tail wagging weakly. Whatever that thing was, it was gone for now, but Lena knew this wasn't over. Lena cradled Max's face in her hands, her fingers trembling as she inspected him for injuries. The dog's eyes, usually full of energy and mischief, were now heavy with exhaustion. His sides heaved with every breath, but there was no mistaking the determination in his gaze. "You brave, brave boy," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "You saved me." Max licked her cheek, a soft whine escaping his throat. Despite his weariness, he pushed against her, nuzzling her for comfort. Lena glanced around the clearing, her heart still racing. The unnatural light that had bathed the area was gone, leaving only the faint glow of the moon. Shadows loomed like silent witnesses, but there was no sign of the creature. Her instincts screamed for her to leave, to get Max to safety, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly Max stiffened. His ears perked up and his eyes focused intently on the edge of the clearing. Lena followed his gaze, fear gripping her once more. From the shadows emerged another figure. At first, Lena's breath caught, thinking the creature had returned. But as the figure stepped into the moonlight, she realized it was human, or at least it seemed to be. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood at the edge of the clearing. His hair was wild, falling in dark tangles around his face. His clothes were a patchwork of rough fabric and animal hides, and a long, weathered coat hung from his shoulders. But it was his eyes that drew her attention, piercing and sharp, glinting like the edge of a blade. They held a quiet intensity, as if he saw everything, every detail, every secret. "Who are you?" Lena's voice wavered as she tightened her grip on Max's leash, though the dog was already standing protectively in front of her. The man didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. Max growled low in his throat, his body tense. "I mean, no harm," the man said, his voice gravelly and calm. He raised his hands, palms outward. "But you shouldn't be here, not tonight." "What do you mean?" Lena asked, her fear mingling with confusion. "Who are you?" The man's gaze shifted to Max, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Your dog's a fighter, loyal too. He saved your life, didn't he?" Lena didn't respond, her mind racing. The man's sudden appearance, his cryptic words, it was all too much. "How do you know that? Were you watching us?" "I heard the commotion," he said simply, his tone matter-of-fact. "And I've seen that thing before." Lena's blood ran cold. "You've seen it?" The man nodded. "It's not the first time it's come through these woods. And it won't be the last." She stared at him, trying to process his words. "What was it? What did it want?" The man hesitated, his expression darkening. "It's hard to explain. But that thing, it feeds on fear. It hunts in the shadows, preying on those who wander too far from the safety of the light. Lena shivered, her grip on Max tightening. "Why should I believe you?" The man shrugged. "You don't have to. But you saw it, didn't you? You felt it. That thing isn't natural. It doesn't belong in this world." Lena's heart pounded as she recalled the creature's hollow eyes, its grotesque grin. She wanted to dismiss the man's words as nonsense, but deep down, she knew he was right. "I need to get back," she said, her voice trembling. "Max is hurt and I—" The man stepped forward, cutting her off. "You won't make it alone," Lena bristled. "I've lived near these woods my whole life. I can find my way." "These aren't the woods you grew up with," he said, his tone firm. "Not anymore. That thing, it's changed everything. The paths you think you know, they're not the same at night." Lena opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. Something in the man's eyes, an unwavering certainty, made her pause. "Why are you helping us?" The man's expression softened, and for a moment, he seemed almost vulnerable. "Because I've seen what happens when people face that thing alone, and because I can't let another soul be lost to it." Max let out a low whine, drawing Lena's attention. The dog was swaying slightly, his strength clearly waning. Her resolve hardened. Whatever this man's motives were, she couldn't risk staying here any longer. "Fine," she said. "But if you try anything—" "I won't," he interrupted, his voice steady. "You have my word." Lena nodded reluctantly, her grip on Max's leash firm. The man turned and motioned for her to follow. As they made their way through the forest, the man led with confidence, navigating the darkened paths with an ease that unnerved Lena. The air was heavy, each sound amplified in the silence. The crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the distant hoot of an owl. It all felt too loud, too sharp. "Where are you taking us?" Lena asked after a few minutes, her voice low. "There's a cabin not far from here," the man replied. "Safe place. You can rest there until morning." Lena hesitated. "How do I know it's safe?" "You don't," he admitted. "But it's safer than out here." She didn't like his answer, but she didn't have much choice. Max was struggling to keep up, and her own strength was fading. For now she had to trust him. As they walked, Lena couldn't help but study the man. He moved with a quiet confidence, his every step deliberate. There was something about him that felt out of place, like he didn't quite belong in the world she knew. "Who are you, really?" she asked after a while. "You never told me. To your name?" The man glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Call me Sam." "Sam," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "And you live out here in the woods?" He nodded. "Been out here for years. Learned to survive, to stay out of its way." Lena frowned. "Why stay? Why not leave?" Sam's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer. "Some things you can't run from, some things you have to face." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lena wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. Whatever his story was, it wasn't something he was ready to share. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a cabin, its wooden walls weathered but sturdy. A faint glow emanated from the windows, a warm contrast to the cold darkness of the forest. Sam opened the door and stepped aside, gesturing for Lena to enter. She hesitated, glancing at Max. The dog sniffed the air, his tail wagging weakly. It was enough to convince her. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A worn sofa sat near. The fireplace and shelves lined with books and tools adorned the room. "You can rest here," Sam said, closing the door behind them. "I'll keep watch." Lena lowered herself onto the sofa, exhaustion washing over her. Max curled up at her feet, his eyes drooping. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Sam nodded, his gaze fixed on the window. "Get some sleep. You'll need your strength for what's coming." As Lena drifted off, her mind swirled with questions. Who was Sam? What was that creature? And why did she feel like her life would never be the same again? Lena woke to the sound of crackling firewood and the faint scent of pine smoke. For a fleeting moment, she thought she was back home, waking up on a winter morning, wrapped in the familiar comfort of her own bed. But the reality came rushing back as her eyes landed on the rugged wooden walls of Sam's cabin, and Max curled up at her feet, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Sam was by the window, staring out into the forest. The first rays of dawn seeped through the trees, painting the clearing in soft hues of orange and gold. He stood motionless, his posture tense, like a sentry guarding a fortress. "Morning," Lena said, her voice hoarse. Sam didn't turn. "It's quiet. Too quiet." Lena sat up, her muscles stiff and aching. "That's supposed to be a good thing, right?" Sam finally glanced at her, his eyes shadowed with concern. "Not out here. Quiet means it's watching." A chill ran down Lena's spine. She glanced at Max, who was still sleeping soundly, his injuries seemingly healed enough to let him rest. "What do you mean?" "That thing," Sam said, gesturing toward the woods with a tilt of his head. "It's clever, it doesn't give up, it's just waiting for the right moment." Lena swallowed hard. "What does it want from us?" "Fear," Sam replied simply. "It thrives on it. The more you're scared, the stronger it gets." The words hung heavy in the air. Lena's mind replayed the events of the previous night. The grotesque figure, the suffocating terror, the way it had seemed to feed on her panic. It all made a terrible kind of sense. Sam grabbed a rucksack from a corner of the cabin and began packing supplies, cans of food, a flashlight, and a bundle of rope. "We can't stay here much longer. It knows we're here." Lena stood, her exhaustion giving way to a rising sense of urgency. "Where will we go?" "Deeper into the woods," Sam said, tightening the straps on the bag. "There's a place." "I know, a safe zone. It's not easy to reach, but it's our best shot." Lena frowned. "Deeper? Shouldn't we be trying to get out of the woods?" Sam shook his head. "The closer you get to the edge, the stronger it gets. Out there, there's no cover, no protection. It'll pick us off before we even get close." She wanted to argue, to demand a better plan, but the look in Sam's eyes stopped her. He knew these woods, he'd survived here. For now, she had no choice but to trust him. The three of them set out shortly after sunrise, Max walking close to Lena's side. He seemed better, his limp barely noticeable, but Lena could tell he was still on high alert. His ears twitched at every rustle of leaves, his nose constantly testing the air. The forest felt different in the daylight. The shadows were softer, less menacing, but there was an eerie stillness that set Lena's nerves on edge. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the silence. Sam led the way, his movements quiet and purposeful. He carried a long wooden staff, its end sharpened to a point. Lena followed closely, her heart pounding with every step. After about an hour, they came to a stream. The water was clear, sparkling in the sunlight, and Lena felt a brief moment of relief. She crouched down to fill her bottle, letting the cool water soothe her hands, but Max didn't drink. Instead, he stood at the edge of the stream, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Max," Lena said softly, but the dog didn't respond. Sam noticed, too. He moved beside Max, squinting into the trees. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What is it?" Lena asked, her pulse quickening. Sam didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for her to follow. They crossed the stream quickly, the icy water biting at their ankles. On the other side, the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt heavier, the light dimmer. Lena's skin prickled with unease, as if the forest itself was watching them. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. A low guttural noise that sent shivers down Lena's spine. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Sam stopped too, his grip tightening on the staff. "Keep moving," he said, his voice barely audible. "Don't look back." Lena wanted to ask why, but the fear in his voice silenced her. She clutched Max's leash and quickened her pace, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound grew louder, a chilling blend of growls and distorted laughter. It seemed to echo from every direction, surrounding them. Lena's hands shook as she held on to Max, who was now growling softly, his fur bristling. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a shadow darting between the trees. It moved impossibly fast, its shape shifting and flickering like smoke. "Run!" Sam shouted. Lena didn't need to be told twice. She broke into a sprint, Max keeping pace beside her. The forest blurred around her as branches whipped at her face and arms. The sound of footsteps, too many to count, thundered behind her, accompanied by that grotesque laughter. Sam was ahead of her, his movements swift and precise. "This way," he called, veering sharply to the left. Lena followed, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. She could feel the presence behind her, closing the distance. The air grew colder, each breath like shards of ice in her chest. Suddenly Sam skidded to a stop. Lena nearly collided with him, her eyes wide with panic. "Why did you stop?" she gasped. Sam pointed ahead. A massive chasm stretched before them, its edges jagged and crumbling. The gap was too wide to jump, too deep to climb down. "We're trapped?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Sam said, his eyes scanning the area. "There's a way across." Before Lena could ask what he meant, the creature emerged from the trees. It was even more horrifying in the daylight. Its twisted skeletal form seemed to writhe and pulse, its hollow eyes fixed on them. The air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves. Max stepped forward, growling fiercely. Lena grabbed his collar, trying to pull him back, but the dog wouldn't budge. "Over here," Sam shouted, running toward a fallen tree that spanned the chasm like a makeshift bridge. "Hurry!" Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second, then followed. The tree was slick with moss, its surface uneven and unstable. Sam crossed first, his movements quick but careful. "Come on," he urged, holding out his hand. Lena stepped onto the tree, her heart pounding in her ears. Max followed, his paws slipping slightly on the mossy surface. The creature let out a piercing screech, its body contorting as it advanced toward them. Halfway across, the tree groaned under their weight. Lena's foot slipped and she cried out, grabbing onto a branch to steady herself. Max barked, his teeth bared as the creature neared the edge of the chasm. "Hurry!" Sam yelled. With a surge of adrenaline, Lena pushed herself forward. Max, right behind her. Just as they reached the other side, the tree gave a deafening crack. It splintered and fell, tumbling into the abyss below. The creature stopped at the edge of the chasm, its hollow eyes staring at them. It let out another screech, a sound filled with rage and frustration, before retreating into the shadows. Lena collapsed to the ground, her body shaking. Max pressed against her, his warmth grounding her. Sam knelt beside them, his face grim but relieved. "That was too close," he muttered. Lena looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and gratitude. "Thank you." Sam nodded, his expression softening. "We're not out of the woods yet." As the adrenaline from their narrow escape subsided, Lena found herself walking in a daze. The forest was quieter now, but not in a comforting way. The air felt heavy with tension, as if the trees themselves held their breath. Max trotted beside her, his nose twitching at every unfamiliar scent. Sam led the way, his staff gripped tightly, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. "We need to keep moving," Sam said over his shoulder. "The safe zone isn't far." Lena nodded, though her legs felt like lead. She glanced down at Max, who seemed more alert than ever, his ears perked and his gaze fixed ahead. Despite the lingering fear, she couldn't help but marvel at the bond they'd formed. In the short time since their ordeal began, Max had become more than just a dog. He was her protector, her constant companion in this nightmare. "Sam," Lena said hesitantly. "Why are you helping us?" Sam slowed his pace but didn't look back. "Because someone helped me once." His answer was cryptic, but Lena didn't press. She could see the shadows in his eyes, the kind that came from years of hardship. There was a story there, one she wasn't sure he was ready to share. As the sun climbed higher, they came upon a small clearing. A dilapidated cabin stood at its center, its wooden walls weathered and overgrown with moss. Sam approached cautiously, motioning for Lena to stay back. "Wait here," he said, disappearing inside. Lena knelt beside Max, her fingers absently stroking his fur. The dog's body was tense, his gaze fixed on the cabin. A soft growl rumbled in his throat. "It's okay, Max," Lena whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Moments later, Sam emerged carrying a bundle of old supplies, bandages, a rusted lantern, and a battered journal. He handed the journal to Lena without a word. "What's this?" she asked, flipping through its pages. The handwriting was messy, the ink smudged, but she could make out fragments of sentences. "They come at night. The woods are alive. Trust the animals. It belonged to the last person who tried to survive out here," Sam said grimly. "They didn't make it." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. "Why would you give this to me?" "Because you need to understand what we're dealing with," Sam said. "This isn't just some wild animal. It's something ancient. Something that's been here long before us." Lena swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the journal. She glanced at Max, who was watching her intently, as if sensing her unease. "Do you believe in fate?" She asked suddenly. Sam raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Lena hesitated. "Because it feels like Max was meant to find me, like he knew I needed him." Sam didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Max, his expression softening. "Dogs are special," he said. "They see things we can't. They know things we don't." Lena nodded, her thoughts swirling. She'd always loved animals, but she'd never felt a connection as strong as the one she had with Max. It was as if he understood her in a way no one else ever had. As they continued their journey, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the journal held more than just warnings. There was something about its cryptic messages that tugged at her, as if it held the key to their survival. That night, as they set up camp in a sheltered grove, Lena sat by the fire, poring over the journal's pages. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, while Sam stood watch a few feet away. One passage caught her eye. "The light keeps them away. But it's not enough. You have to fight the fear. If you give in, they'll take you." "What does it mean?" Lena murmured to herself. "It means you can't let it win," Sam said, startling her. He'd moved closer without her noticing. "The more you fear it, the stronger it gets." Lena looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "But how do you stop being afraid of something like that?" Sam sat down across from her, his expression serious. "You don't. Fear's not something you can just turn off, but you can control it. You can choose how you react to it." Lena absorbed his words, her gaze drifting to Max. The dog was watching her, his eyes filled with an unspoken trust. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, finding comfort in the simple act. "Max isn't afraid," she said quietly. "That's because he trusts you," Sam said. "He knows you'll protect him just like he'll protect you." As the fire crackled and the stars began to dot the sky, Lena found herself thinking about her life before the woods. She thought about the small apartment she shared with her sister, the long hours she worked at a job she didn't love, and the emptiness she'd felt despite it all. "What's your story?" she asked Sam, breaking the silence. Sam hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I came here to escape," he said finally. "Thought I could start over, leave everything behind." Lena waited, sensing there was more. "But the woods don't let you escape," Sam continued. "They force you to face yourself, your fears, your regrets, your mistakes. You can't run from them here." His words struck a chord in Lena. She'd spent so much of her life running, from her past, from her pain, from herself. But here, in the middle of nowhere, there was no escaping. There was only the fight to survive. "What are you running from?" Sam asked, turning the question back on her. Lena hesitated, the truth catching in her throat. "Everything," she admitted, "but mostly myself." Sam nodded, as if he understood. "Out here, you don't have a choice. You either face it, or you let it consume you." Lena looked at Max, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I'm not going to let it consume me," she said firmly. "Not anymore." Sam smiled faintly. "Good." That night, as Lena lay awake under the stars, the journal clutched to her chest, she felt a spark of hope. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't running, she was fighting. And with Max by her side, she knew she could face whatever the woods threw at them. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Shadows stretched long and jagged in the flickering light of Sam's lantern. Lena clutched Max's leash tightly, her knuckles white against the coarse material. Sam walked ahead, his staff tapping rhythmically against the ground, a steady counterpoint to the pounding of Lena's heart. "This is it," Sam said, his voice low but steady. He gestured ahead to a massive tree, its twisted roots clawing at the earth like skeletal hands. At its base was a dark opening, wide enough for a person to crawl through. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if the tree itself exuded malice. Lena's stomach twisted. "What? What is that?" Sam's expression was grim. "It's where it lives." "It?" Lena's voice cracked despite her effort to remain calm. Sam nodded. "The thing that's been hunting us. The thing that won't stop until it's fed." Max let out a low growl, his ears flattened against his head. Lena knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she stroked his fur. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to reassure, Max or herself. "We need to destroy it," Sam said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The journal mentioned fire. It's the only way." Lena swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "How do we even get close enough?" Sam's gaze shifted to Max, and Lena immediately shook her head. "No, absolutely not. He's not going in there." "It's not about what we want," Sam said firmly. "It's about survival. If we don't stop it here, it'll follow us. It'll follow you." Lena looked at Max, who stared back at her with an almost human intensity. His tail didn't wag, his body was still, but there was no fear in his eyes, only trust. "Max is brave," Sam said softly. "Braver than most people I've met. He knows what needs to be done." Lena felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. "If we're doing this," she said, her voice shaking but resolute, "we're doing it together." Sam handed Lena a makeshift torch, its end wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. He lit it with a match, and the flame roared to life, casting a warm glow over the three of them. Lena held it tightly, the heat a small comfort against the chill creeping up her spine. "Stay close," Sam said, leading the way toward the opening. As they approached, a deep, guttural growl emanated from within the tree, vibrating through the ground. Lena's breath hitched, and Max let out a sharp bark, his stance defensive. "Don't stop," Sam urged. "It's trying to scare us." The darkness within the tree seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent energy. Lena's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move step by step until they were standing at the edge of the opening. Suddenly, a shadow lunged from the darkness, a monstrous blur of claws and teeth. Lena screamed, stumbling back, but Max was faster. He launched himself at the creature, his teeth sinking into its forearm. The thing howled, its voice an unnatural mix of animalistic rage and human agony. "Max!" Lena cried, her heart in her throat. Sam sprang into action, swinging his staff with precision. The creature shrieked as the wood connected with its skull, and it recoiled into the shadows. "We have to go in now," Sam shouted, "while it's weak." Lena hesitated, her eyes darting to Max. The dog stood firm, his chest heaving but his resolve unshaken. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and followed Sam into the tree. The interior was a nightmarish maze of gnarled roots and pulsating walls, as if the tree were alive and breathing. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and Lena fought the urge to retch. Max stayed close, his growls low and steady, a constant reassurance in the oppressive darkness. Ahead, Sam's torch illuminated the creature. It was larger than she'd realized, its form a grotesque fusion of beast and shadow. Its eyes glowed like burning coals, and its jagged teeth glistened with saliva. Sam hurled his torch at the creature, the flames licking at its oily fur. It let out a deafening roar, thrashing wildly as the fire consumed it. "Keep it distracted," Sam yelled. "We need more fire." Lena scrambled to light another torch, her hands shaking so badly that she almost dropped the match. Max barked furiously, darting around the creature to draw its attention. Come on," Lena muttered as the torch finally caught. She hurled it at the creature, hitting it square in the chest. The flames spread quickly, engulfing the beast in a fiery blaze. For a moment it seemed as though they'd won. The creature's screams echoed through the chamber, its form collapsing into a heap of burning ash. But then the ground began to shake. and the walls of the tree trembled. Violently, "What's happening?" Lena cried. "It's not just the creature," Sam shouted over the noise. "The tree is its heart. We have to get out before it collapses." Lena grabbed Max's leash, pulling him close as they sprinted toward the exit. The walls began to cave in, roots snapping like whips and chunks of bark raining down around them. "Run!" Sam yelled, his voice urgent. They burst out of the tree just as it imploded, a deafening roar filling the air. Lena stumbled, falling to her knees, but Max was there, nudging her to her feet. She turned to see Sam limping toward them, his face streaked with soot but alive. The three of them stood in silence, watching as the tree burned. The fire spread quickly, consuming the surrounding forest in a blaze of light and heat. Lena felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, as if they'd lost something even as they'd won. "It's over," Sam said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Lena knelt beside Max, wrapping her arms around him. "We did it," she whispered, her tears soaking into his fur. "You did it." Max licked her face, his tail wagging for the first time in what felt like hours. Despite everything, he was still her loyal companion, her hero. In the days that followed, Lena, Max, and Sam made their way out of the forest. The journey was slow and arduous, but the weight that had hung over them was gone. The woods felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, Lena turned back for one last look. The charred remains of the tree were barely visible in the distance, but she could still feel its presence, a reminder of the battle they'd fought and won. "What now?" she asked Sam. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Now, we live." Lena knelt beside Max, scratching behind his ears. "We couldn't have done it without you," she said. Max barked in agreement, his eyes bright with pride. As they walked away from the forest, Lena felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. With Max by her side, she could face anything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lena sat on her porch, Max curled at her feet. The forest loomed in the distance, its edges softened by the evening light. It was hard to believe that just days ago it had been the setting of their darkest hours. Now it was simply part of the landscape, a reminder of what they'd endured, and the bond that had carried them through. Lena reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns of his fur. "You're a hero, you know that?" she murmured. Max tilted his head, his expressive eyes meeting hers as if he understood every word. He let out a soft woof, his tail thumping against the wooden floorboards. Sam had stayed for a while after they returned, helping to restore some sense of normalcy to Lena's life. Together they cleared the mess in her yard, repaired her chicken coop, and mended the broken fence. But one morning, he'd packed his bag and tipped his hat with a quiet, "Take care, Lena, and you too, Max." He'd left behind his journal, its pages filled with scribbled notes and sketches of the forest and its secrets. "You'll want to hold on to this," he'd said, "for when you tell the story." At the time, Lena had laughed. But now, with the journal in her lap and Max snoring softly at her feet, she realized he was right. There was a story here, one of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog. The days that followed their ordeal were filled with quiet reflection. Lena found herself appreciating the small, ordinary moments that she'd once taken for granted, the golden warmth of the sun on her face, the gentle clucking of her chickens, the rhythmic creak of her porch swing. Every detail felt sharper, more vivid, as if the danger they'd faced had heightened her awareness of life's simple joys. Max seemed to feel it too. He was more protective than ever, following her from room to room, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger. But he was also more playful, his tail wagging with an exuberance that hadn't been there before. It was as if he knew they'd come through something extraordinary together, and now every moment was worth celebrating. One evening, as Lena was sorting through a box of old photos, she came across a picture of herself as a child, holding a scruffy puppy in her arms. She smiled, tracing the image with her fingertip. That dog had been her first companion, her first protector. It struck her how much Max reminded her of him, not just in appearance, but in spirit. She held the photo up for Max to see. "You would have liked him," she said softly. "He was brave too." Max cocked his head, his tail wagging as if in agreement. Lena laughed, the sound light and carefree. For the first time in years, she felt whole. Word of their adventure had spread through the small town. Neighbors stopped by to check on her, bringing casseroles and pies as if food could somehow ward off lingering shadows. They listened with wide-eyed fascination as she recounted their journey, though she left out the darker, more terrifying details. Some stories, she decided, were meant to remain between those who lived them. One day, a local journalist came by, a young woman with a notepad and a camera slung over her shoulder. "I heard you had quite the adventure," she said, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Lena hesitated, glancing at Max. He wagged his tail, his expression as if to say, "Why not?" So Lena told the story, her words painting vivid pictures of the forest, the creature, and the bond that had seen them through. The journalist listened intently, jotting down notes and snapping photos of Max, who posed with a dignity that made Lena chuckle. When the article was published, the headline read, "A Hero with Four Paws, How a Dog Saved His Owner from the Forest's Darkness." It was accompanied by a photo of Max, his intelligent eyes staring straight into the camera. The article brought visitors to Lena's doorstep, some curious, some skeptical, but most simply wanting to meet the dog who had become a local legend. Max took it all in stride, wagging his tail and accepting pats and treats with a calm confidence. But for Lena, the attention was a double-edged sword. While she appreciated the recognition, she found herself longing for the quiet life she'd known before. The forest, with all its dangers and mysteries, had taught her the value of peace and simplicity. One afternoon, as Lena and Max were walking through the meadow near her home, she stopped to take in the view. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, and the wildflowers painted the landscape in bursts of color. The forest loomed in the distance, its edges softened by the golden light of the setting sun. Lena knelt beside Max, wrapping her arms around him. "You changed everything," she whispered. "You saved me, not just in the forest, but here, too. You reminded me what it means to live." Max licked her cheek, his tail wagging. In that moment, Lena felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Max, but for the experience that had brought them closer together. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found and strength to be drawn from the bonds we hold dear. As they made their way back home, Lena found herself thinking about the future. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. With Max by her side, she was ready to face whatever came their way. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Lena looked down at Max, who trotted along happily at her side. "Come on, hero," she said. With a smile, "Let's go home."